Now, welcome to part 9 of my story about what happens if Ahsoka Tano never leaves the Jedi Order, and instead she and Fives begin to unravel the true purpose of the Clone Army, which is, of course, to carry out Order 66 and destroy the Jedi. And very quickly before getting back to it, if you haven't seen the first 8 parts of this, I would highly recommend starting at part 1, and if you like it, working your way back to this part. Otherwise, this video or part of the story really isn't going to make any sense to you, and a link to the whole playlist will be in the comments and description below. And one other quick note here, with next Tuesday being May the 4th, and it also being the day the first episode of The Bad Batch will be released, there will not be a new episode up until Wednesday or maybe Thursday at the latest. Either way, there will be one next week. Again, it'll just be delayed. And so without further ado, let's get back to the story. We start focused in on the sleeping face of Maul and watch as moments later his eyes shoot open and he immediately scrambles to his feet and begins to look around and take stock of his situation, and quickly discovers that he's still on his ship, but that it's empty now, and that, by looking out the front viewport, he discovers it's apparently not on Coruscant anymore, but instead it's landed somewhere on a murky and swampy world, a world we of course recognize to be Dagobah. And it's as Maul is looking out that he sees 2 figures suddenly emerge from out behind a gnarled old tree not too far off in the distance. One of them appears to be almost a young-looking Palpatine, but not too young, he's maybe in his 30s or 40s, while the other is a Zabrak child. Maul then watches as the young Palpatine motions for the Zabrak child to follow him deeper into the swamp, which the child does, but not before he turns and very briefly locks eyes with Maul. That's when Maul says to himself, No, not again, not again, as his hand drops to his side, only to discover no lightsaber there. After an angry curse or two, Maul then hastily turns and exits his ship, and though he no longer sees them, he begins to run in the direction that they were heading off in, and runs headfirst into a dense portion of the swamp without a second thought. That's when we're taken to a different part of the swamp, though one not too far off from where we just were at before. In fact, as we watch Ahsoka Tano stand at the entrance to a dark cave that descends below a large, ancient-looking tree, a hesitant look on her face and Maul's double-bladed lightsaber in her hand, the one Yoda asked her to take, we can hear the not-too-distant screams and curses of Maul as he makes his way through the swamp and draws ever closer. That's when we hear the voice of Yoda in Ahsoka's head say, "In you must go, young one, and when you emerge, a Jedi shall you be." A look of resolve then comes across her face, and after taking a deep breath, she boldly walks into the cave, where after several steps of darkness like a cloud seems to swirl all around her and ends up consuming her. And as she stands in the center of this swirling cloud, she begins to see colors and shapes, and they begin to form into an all too familiar place, the halls of the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, and she finds herself standing behind Yoda and Plo Koon, who seem to be taking a leisurely stroll while discussing something. Immediately, Ahsoka calls out to them, but neither seem to be able to hear or see her, and so she starts to follow and listens and hears Plo Koon say, "It is a shame that little Ahsoka has been such a disappointment. I once had very high hopes for her." Yoda nods a bit and responds, "Yes, slow to learn she is, yet also so sure of herself at the same time, even though far surpassed by the other students she has been, though see it she does not. What to do with her, unsure I am." They both then think in quiet for a moment before Plo Koon says, "Perhaps it is time to give up, to waste no more of her time or our own." Once again Yoda nods in agreement. "Understand she must, that her own failure this is." Yoda thinks for a moment, then continues, "Suggest a Padawan for Skywalker, Palpatine has, and agree with him I do. Learning to let go he must, and so his Padawan Ahsoka shall become. In his shadows she can dwell, till give up and walk away she does. Unworthy she is to become a Jedi. Never do all what must be done, will she?" Plo Koon shakes his head a bit and then says, "I fear even then she will still find a way to blame the Jedi for her doubt and failures. How could I ever have been so wrong about her?" Yoda quickly responds, "Wrong about her too, I was. But Skywalker's problem she can now be." At that point, Ahsoka stops following and simply shuts her eyes and hangs her head a bit, as a black cloud again begins to swirl around her and consumes her, which is when we're taken back outside the cave and see Maul ever so quickly approaching it, and from his perspective we now see again the younger Palpatine and this Zabrak child, and this time they're standing at the very entrance to the cave. And once again we watch as Palpatine beckons the child forward, and after again turning to lock eyes with Maul ever so briefly, the child turns and follows Palpatine down into the darkness, which is when Maul screams out in anger and runs full speed after them and down into the cave himself. He gets several paces in when suddenly there is a blinding green flash and the sound of a lightsaber being swung that stops Maul dead in his tracks. And he now finds himself not only back in the reactor core on Naboo, but face to face with Obi-Wan Kenobi, who has a very smug expression on his older face, or the age he currently is, not young like he was when he first met Maul in this very location. Kenobi then reaches out his hand and, rather gently, and with a smile, gives Maul a bit of a push, and Maul begins to helplessly fall backwards, or at least part of him does. The upper part goes tumbling and falling down the shaft behind him, while his legs remain in place above. We're then yet again taken to a different part of Dagobah, where we see Yoda just patiently sitting upon a log, the Night Sister child Merrin nearby, fascinated by and playing with some lizard creature she's come across in the swamp, when suddenly Yoda hears the voice of Qui-Gon Jinn say, "The first two have entered, and the next two now arrive." It's then that Yoda hears, somewhere in the distance, the sound of a ship coming in for a landing, and by the sound of the engines we can guess that it's Dooku's solar sailor, that he and Anakin have now arrived. We then hear the voice of Qui-Gon Jinn say, "I will make sure they find their way to the cave as well, and then we must wait. Time will work differently in there for them. It may feel like days for you and the child Merrin, but it may only feel like a short while for them, or maybe much, much longer." Yoda then asks, "And what of me? Face this same trial? I will not? Meant to face Sidious? I am not?" Qui-Gon quickly answers, "No, my old friend. This has always been the destiny of Anakin, to end the Sith forever and bring about a new age of the Jedi Order, a destiny I was meant to prepare him for, but that now only those that enter the cave with him to first face a needed trial, as well as one other yet. Only they can help Anakin. They can help him prevent the coming darkness of the Sith." Yoda looks a little confused, but remains silent as Qui-Gon continues, "One way or another, your time guiding the Jedi Order has come to an end. And so it is here you shall remain, to first be trained, to follow and complete the path I could only begin before my death, to one day offer a new hope, should Anakin and the others fail their test now, or fail later against Sidious." See their victory, you cannot. Said before you did, that the past and future is known to you. Qui-Gon responds, "I can see their victory, but I can also see their defeat. The future is dictated by the actions of those in the present. All who live get to choose the path they walk. Nothing is ever set in stone. All things are only ever guided towards balance by the will of the Force, a will the Jedi must follow above all else to ensure that balance." Yoda hangs his head a bit. "Failed the Order, I have." Qui-Gon quickly responds, "No, this is not your failure. Sidious's strength with the dark side is nearly absolute, and it clouds everything, even the minds of the Jedi, until the will of the Force can no longer be heard clearly by them. It was only when I realized this was happening that I sought answers and encountered a shaman who began to train me. But I could not complete that training before my death, and it was only once the veil was broken, only when the gateway that is Mortis was opened, that I was able to call out through the Force, and only you, of all the Jedi, were able to hear that call, Yoda. And if you had not, all hope may be lost now. But instead, thanks to you, Anakin still follows his destiny, ready to face his greatest trial." We're then taken back into the cave, or into some sort of vision within the cave, where we see Ahsoka walking near the shore of a river, but it is not a river of water, but rather one of lava, and we quickly recognize she's on Mustafar, or again, on a vision of that planet. And on her suit and ash-covered face is a look of utter exhaustion, and we get the impression she's been walking for a very, very long time, at least from her point of view, and that she's likely been in deep thought the whole time, thinking about what she heard Yoda and Plo Koon say. That's when we suddenly hear a voice call out her name, and that voice belongs to Anakin Skywalker, and she quickly turns to see her master bounding down a nearby rocky outcropping towards her, and as he does, the somewhat startled-looking Ahsoka does her best to hide Maul's lightsaber behind her back. She then hears, echoing in her head, the words of Yoda from before, from the vision say, "In his shadow she can dwell, till give up and walk away she does. Unworthy she is to be a Jedi. Never do all that must be done, will she?" And so Ahsoka hangs her head and looks down at the dark, charred, rocky ground at her feet, unable to look in her master's eyes as he reaches her. Anakin then says, "Boy, am I glad to see you here, Snips. Wherever here is exactly." Anakin then glances all around and continues, "Not that I even remember how I got here. Last thing I remember I was..." Anakin cuts himself off, and the expression on his face both saddens and darkens. "Last thing I can remember, I was leaving you on Dathomir with Maul to run and confront Palpatine." Anakin then shuts his eyes, shakes his head a bit, and sighs rather regretfully. He then opens them, looks down at Ahsoka, and says, "But hey, at least you're not still with him, or with him at all." We then see Ahsoka's grip on Maul's saber tighten, but she's still staring down at the ground and holding it behind her back. Anakin then continues, "Not that I ever thought you could possibly..." But Anakin cuts himself off, now noticing Ahsoka's odd behavior, and that she is indeed holding something behind her back. What is that?" Anakin says, taking another step towards Ahsoka, which causes Ahsoka, who still won't look at Anakin, to take a step back. Anakin takes another larger step towards Ahsoka, but yet again she takes another step back. There's then a long, tense moment between the two, before Anakin all but lunges at her, which causes Ahsoka to try to backpedal quickly. So quickly, in fact, that she tumbles backwards and drops the saber. And when Anakin sees it, his eyes, of course, focus on it. Did you join with Maul? And how did you get his saber? Did you kill him and take it? Already following the ways of the Sith? You already killed him and took his place?" Ahsoka then grabs the saber she dropped and snaps back. "And what about you? You rushed off to talk with Palpatine, and then what happened? Did you start doing your new master's bidding right away, telling me to stay put because I knew the truth, that Palpatine is really Sidious? Am I an inconvenience you're now here to finish off?" Finally, Ahsoka looks up at Anakin and sees that, from her point of view, his eyes are yellow and his face is twisted with rage and anger. But from our point of view, that's not so much the case. There's some anger on his face, but his eyes are not yellow. In fact, after Ahsoka's harsh words, his look seems to be calming slightly, which is when we hear another voice call out, the voice of Obi-Wan Kenobi, who says, "You are my brother, Anakin!" Both Ahsoka and Anakin turn their heads to see Obi-Wan quickly approaching. It's Anakin who says, "Obi-Wan? But how? Why? What are you doing here?" Obi-Wan shakes his head and says, "I've been sent here to do what I must, Anakin." Anakin looks confused, and so Obi-Wan explains, "Did you really think the Council wouldn't figure out that you had joined with Dooku?" Anakin gives a sheepish grin and says, "Wait, I can explain that." Which is when Ahsoka's eyes narrow on him, and she says, "Dooku? You joined with Dooku?" Anakin then responds to her, "Well, yes, but together we're going to destroy Sidious, and..." Ahsoka then interrupts and says, "And what? Take his place? And you accused me of behaving like a Sith." She gets to her feet then, Maul's saber still in her hand, and begins to back up and away from Anakin and towards Obi-Wan. Anakin then says, "Wait, I can explain all this, you just have to listen." But Obi-Wan says, "We're done listening, Anakin. You've clearly made your choice, and now you have become the very thing you swore to destroy." Anakin shakes his head vigorously. "No, you don't understand. Let me explain." But Obi-Wan says, "We're not interested in your lies, Anakin. Not anymore. This is the day Ahsoka frees herself from your shadow. The day she becomes a Jedi." Those words seem to click with Ahsoka, exhausted or not, and she turns and looks at Obi-Wan. He then looks at her and then at the saber being held in her hand and says to her, "Would you mind sharing? I seem to have misplaced mine." Ahsoka nods and twists Maul's double-bladed saber, and it splits in two, one part of which she hands to Obi-Wan, who activates it. The other part she then activates herself. The two then stand side by side, crimson-red sabers blazing, and face Anakin. It's then that we see things from just Anakin's perspective, and he, but not Ahsoka, hears Obi-Wan say, "You were wrong, Anakin. It wasn't Ahsoka who killed Maul. It was me. She has simply decided to join me, to finally have a proper master. You see, I could never forgive Maul for what he did to Satine, killing her in cold blood. And if you were a true friend, if you were really my brother, Anakin, you would have helped me to hunt him down." Obi-Wan then shakes his head as if disappointed. But no, you have Padme. You get to be happy with her, so who cares about anything and everything else in the galaxy? But when I'm done here, when me and my new apprentice hack you to pieces and leave you for dead, we'll hunt down Padme and let you feel the same pain I felt. From across the stars you will feel her death at my hand, and you will finally understand how selfish you are just before you die. We then see tears welling up in Anakin's eyes as he almost subconsciously reaches for and ignites his blue lightsaber. We then hear him mutter to himself, No, you've both turned against me. He then charges at them, tears streaming down his face as he screams out, You will not take her from me! Which is when we shift back to Ahsoka's perspective, who hears Anakin scream those very words, but does not see tears on his face, only hate in his eyes. Obi-Wan then says to Ahsoka as the two brace for Anakin's charging attack, His mind is gone. He thinks I've corrupted you, turned you against him, when he has only done that himself. Ahsoka seems to think on that, but again, all we can see on her face is so much exhaustion and now plenty of confusion. Finally, though, she nods her head and turns and faces Anakin. Obi-Wan then says to her, We'll take him together. Which is when we're taken to a different part of the cave, though again it does not look like a cave at all. Instead it looks like the city of Theed on Naboo, sometime during the early hours of the morning, when the sun is just peeking up over the horizon. And we're in what it looks like a back alley of sorts, somewhere near a docking bay, where crawling out of a sewage drain is Maul, or at least his upper half. And that upper half of him looks emaciated and sickly, like he's been down in the bowels of the city of Theed for many, many long days, kept alive only by his hatred. We then watch as Maul begins to crawl towards that nearby hangar, and we see what appears to be a garbage ship docked, and hear one of the workers say something about how the ship is about ready to depart for Lothal Minor. Maul begins to hastily crawl towards it, but stops himself when what appears to be a Republic shuttle flies overhead, seeming to be coming in for a landing in a nearby docking bay. Maul stares at the shuttle, as if he feels or senses something from it, and whatever it is he senses causes him to stop, and turn around and to start crawling in its direction. And when he does that, Maul suddenly finds himself in a different part of the city entirely, or rather just outside of it, and on a grassy hillside near a short bridge over a stream that leads to a gazebo, the gazebo where, we know, the funeral of Qui-Gon Jinn was held. And though Maul looks utterly confused as to how he got here, that confusion vanishes in an instant when he sees Palpatine, looking the age he did during the Phantom Menace, walking across this bridge and towards the gazebo, and following him is that same Zabrak child from before, only this time when they reach the midpoint of the bridge, Palpatine turns around and shakes his head at the boy, before turning back around and walking up into the gazebo. That boy, abandoned now, then looks towards and sees Maul, who, looking terrified after seeing his former master, has hid himself the best he can in a bush. The boy then runs up to Maul, who angrily tries to shoo him away, and he beckons for Maul to follow him now towards the gazebo, which Maul, despite looking quite fearful, eventually does do. The boy even helps Maul to climb the side of the stone gazebo so that he can peer into one of the windows. And inside is a rather interesting sight, for standing at a window on the opposite side that Maul is peering in through, and looking out towards the rolling plains of Naboo, a look on his face that can only be described as bitter regret, is Count Dooku, while just inside the doorway stands Palpatine, looking ever so patient, as if wanting to respect what is clearly the grieving Count Dooku. Finally, though, Palpatine speaks and says, his voice echoing in the otherwise empty stone chamber, I once heard it said that the Jedi do not mourn the dead, that they celebrate their passing, they celebrate their opportunity to join with the Force. Palpatine then takes a few steps in, looks out the first window he comes to, and continues, which made me wonder, what point do the Jedi even see in life? If all that matters to them, all that awaits us is just the Force, if death is even to be celebrated. Palpatine then, though we can only see his back for the most part, studies Dooku very keenly and carefully before saying, Qui-Gon Jinn was your Padawan, wasn't he? Odd then that I didn't see you here at the funeral to celebrate his death. At that, Dooku takes a very long, deep breath as if trying to control his emotions before speaking. He then says, and it is equally odd to be visited here by the new Chancellor of the Republic. Palpatine gives a bit of a shrug. Perhaps, but not when you consider that it is still my home world, and I've returned to celebrate the signing of a new peace accord between the Naboo and Gungans. And when I heard we had such an esteemed and honorable member of the Jedi Order visiting, one I had not yet met before, I figured I'd take the opportunity to do so. Dooku quickly says back, a former member of the Jedi Order now, I'm afraid. Palpatine grins ever so slightly. Yes, I had heard that too. Dooku finally turns from the window, but when he does, Palpatine has completely vanished, and in his place now stands Obi-Wan Kenobi, but not as he was back then, but instead older as he is now, or in the current time of the story. But Dooku isn't the only one shocked by this turn of events. Maul, who was essentially peeking in the window, is filled with rage the very moment that Kenobi appears, and that anger gets the best of him, and he ends up sliding down the wall and into the grass. Which is when the Zabrak boy comes up to him and hands him a lightsaber that looks like the one that once belonged to Qui-Gon Jinn. And as soon as Maul takes it, he looks down and sees that he once again has his legs back. Inside though, Dooku is staring in awe at Obi-Wan Kenobi, who quickly says to him, "You failed him, you know. You're the reason Qui-Gon is dead, and now look at you. He would be ashamed of what you have become." Dooku shakes his head. "No, Qui-Gon would understand that I'm only doing..." Obi-Wan interrupts and finishes for him. "Only doing what must be done. But at what price? How many deaths are on your hands now, Dooku? How many lives lost in this war that you let yourself be manipulated into believing was necessary? At what point is the greater good eclipsed by the horrors done to bring it about?" Dooku is about to respond when, seemingly out of nowhere, a green lightsaber blade explodes forth from the stomach of Obi-Wan Kenobi, and we see standing behind him, with a grin upon his face and holding that saber, is of course Maul. Which is when we're taken somewhere else in the galaxy entirely, and it's hard to say just how much time has gone by while the events on Dagobah have been playing out, but it's quite possibly been several days. And so now we're in space just above the planet Coruscant, where we see roughly 10 Republic cruisers all in formation. And soon enough we're on the bridge of one of those ships, where we see Obi-Wan Kenobi, Commander Cody, and several other officers all huddled around a holo table that is projecting a map of the galaxy with several locations marked and flashing on it. We also note that Cody is wearing one of the new clone trooper helmets. We then hear one of the officers, an admiral by the looks of him, say that all the other attack groups are at their assigned staging areas and waiting on them, and then for the final order to be given. And that, thankfully, the reactor issue with one of the other ships in their attack group has now been fixed, and they are ready to go. To that, Obi-Wan nods in approval and says to tell the group to stand by and make ready to jump to hyperspace. But no sooner does he say that, than alarms start blaring and everyone starts running around frantically. Obi-Wan asks what's going on, but no one answers him. Not that he ends up needing one, for once he looks out the front viewport, he sees the problem. Separatist ships, more than he can count, and more coming out of hyperspace all the time. And that is where this part ends. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Hopefully this part wasn't too confusing or weird or anything, and that you enjoyed it. Either way though, do tell me what you thought of it in the comments below, or tell me what you think might happen next. So again, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.